In the early 17th century, a small ship reached the shores of what would become the United States. On board were around 20 Africans. They were not travelers. They were not settlers. They were people who had been taken from their homes, forced across an ocean, and sold. That moment would quietly begin a system that would grow for generations. A system built not just on labor, but on control, fear, and violence. Across the Atlantic, millions of Africans were captured. Some were taken during raids. Others were sold. All of them were forced onto ships, packed tightly together, chained in darkness. The journey across the ocean was brutal. There was little food, almost no space. Disease spread quickly, and those who didn't survive were often thrown overboard. For those who did survive, the nightmare was only beginning. When they arrived, they were sold. Men, women, and children were separated. Families were broken apart in moments. A mother could lose her child forever, with no way of knowing where they were taken. From that point on, their lives were no longer their own. They became property, something to be bought, sold, or punished. At first, European settlers relied on indentured servants. But as the demand for labor grew, they turned increasingly to enslaved Africans. Because slavery offered something they wanted more than anything else: control. Complete and permanent control. Laws were passed to make sure that control would never be questioned. Children born into slavery would remain slaves for life, no matter who their parents were, no matter what they did. Freedom was not an option. It was never even considered. Plantations began to spread. Large farms that focused on crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. These crops required constant labor, from sunrise to sunset, and sometimes even longer. And the people who did that labor were not paid. They were owned. Life on these plantations was harsh in ways that are difficult to imagine. The day began before sunrise. Men, women, and even children were sent into the fields. They worked under the heat of the sun, 4 hours without rest, picking cotton until their fingers bled, cutting sugarcane in exhausting heat, working until their bodies gave out. And still, it was never enough. There were expectations, quotas, a certain amount of work that had to be completed each day. If those expectations were not met, punishment followed. Punishments were not rare. They were part of the system. They were meant to control, to create fear, to make sure no one resisted. Whippings were common. Pain was used as a message, not just to the person being punished, but to everyone watching, to remind them what could happen. But physical pain was only one part of it. There was something else, something deeper, something that stayed long after the wounds healed. Fear. People lived in constant fear. Fear of punishment, fear of being sold, fear of losing their family. At any moment, a child could be taken away, a husband sold to another plantation, a mother separated from her children, with no chance of ever seeing them again. Families were not protected. They were not recognized. They existed only as long as someone allowed them to. Living conditions were equally harsh. Small wooden cabins, often shared by many people. Little furniture, little comfort. Food was limited, usually simple meals, just enough to survive. Hunger was common, illness was common, and medical care was almost non-existent. Because to those who owned them, they were not seen as people. They were seen as investments, replaceable. For women, the experience could be even more devastating. They faced the same labor, the same punishments, but also something else. A constant vulnerability, with no protection, no rights, and no way to refuse. Their suffering was often hidden, but deeply felt. Children were not spared. From a very young age, they were expected to work. Some carried water. Some watched other children. Others were sent into the fields. Childhood did not exist. There was no time for it. Despite everything, people resisted. Not always in ways that could be seen. Sometimes it was small, working slower, breaking tools, pretending to be sick. Small acts that allowed them to take back a little control, even if only for a moment. Others tried to escape, running away into forests, or traveling at night, following stars, hoping to find freedom. Some succeeded, many did not, and those who were caught often faced severe punishment, because escape was seen as a threat, not just to one plantation, but to the entire system. There were also larger acts of resistance, rebellions, groups who chose to fight back, even when they knew the risks, even when they knew the outcome, because sometimes the desire for freedom was stronger than the fear of what might happen. But for most, survival meant enduring, finding ways to hold on, to keep going, even when everything was taken from them. In the evenings, after the work was done, there were moments, small moments, where people gathered, shared stories, sang songs, remembered, not just who they were, but who they had been, and who they still were. Despite everything, those songs carried meaning, sometimes hope, sometimes pain, sometimes messages, hidden in words and rhythms, ways to communicate without being understood, ways to hold on to identity in a world that tried to erase it. Because slavery was not just about labor, it was about control. Control over bodies, over movement, over identity, over humanity itself. And yet, that humanity never fully disappeared. It survived. In stories, in culture, in resistance, in the determination to endure, even in the darkest conditions. But the system itself continued to grow. Plantations expanded. The demand for crops increased. And with it, the demand for enslaved labor. By the time the 19th century arrived, millions of people were living in slavery, their labor fueling an entire economy. Crops grown on plantations were shipped across the world. Profits increased. Wealth grew. But that wealth was built on suffering. Entire industries depended on it, not just in the South, but far beyond. Factories, trade networks, financial systems, all connected, all benefiting, which made ending it even more difficult, because for many, slavery was not just a system, it was business, and business was hard to change. But there were those who fought against it, people who spoke out, who wrote, who organized, who resisted, even when it was dangerous, even when it meant risking everything. Voices that refused to stay silent. Stories that exposed the truth. Stories that made it impossible to ignore what was really happening. Over time, those voices grew louder. The pressure increased. The divisions deepened. Until eventually, conflict became unavoidable. A war would come. One that would change the course of the nation and lead to the end of slavery. But even when the system ended, its impact did not. The effects remained. In communities, in history, in the lives of those who had endured it, and those who came after. Because what happened on those plantations was not just part of the past. It shaped the future, in ways that are still felt today. This story is not easy to hear, and it was never meant to be, because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable, something real, a system where people were treated as property, where suffering was normalized, and where humanity was denied. But it is a story that needs to be remembered, not hidden, not softened, but understood, because history is not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, and what we choose to learn from it. If you want to uncover more hidden stories like this, Stories that reveal the darker side of history. Make sure to like the video and subscribe, because there are still many stories that were never meant to be told.